Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar covering the 2025 federal election, Justice and Compassion. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of this nation. I'd like to acknowledge the Kanamaluka people, the land on which I live here in Launceston in Tasmania. And I acknowledge that we are coming together via video from across the lands of other traditional custodians. We pay our respects to ancestors and elders, past and present. We are committed to honouring Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islander people's unique culture and spiritual relationships to the land, waters and seas and their rich contribution to society. I also acknowledge any First Nations people that may be joining us this afternoon. Welcome. A welcome to members, staff and volunteers and those that are joining us that are interested in hearing about the Society's 2025 election statement. I'd like to take a moment to thank the important contributions of our members and volunteers. You are the heart of our mission. You are the heart of the Society. You see the challenges people face every day, whether it's families struggling with the rising cost of living, people experiencing homelessness, or those seeking asylum in a new country. Today, we will outline the key social justice issues that the Society is prioritising in the lead up to the upcoming federal election. The purpose of this webinar is to outline the changes we think are needed at the federal level to address inequality and build a fairer and more just Australia. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce myself and other speakers who will be joining us today. So most of you might know I'm Mark Gaetani. I'm the current National President of the Society here in Australia. I'm the 18th National President. I've been in this role now for a little over 2 years and have enjoyed every single moment and opportunity of those 2 years. Prior to taking on the role as National President, I was the State President for the Society here in Tasmania, been a Vincentian for 10 years now, and my local conference is the Church of the Apostles. I'd also like to introduce the three other speakers that will be joining us this afternoon: Dr. Margaret, Gearon, Dr. Tim McKenna, and Toby, oConnor. Margaret became just a little bit of information on Margaret. Margaret became the first Victorian State Vice President for Social Justice and Advocacy in 2014. Since then, she has chaired the Victorian Social Justice, Social Policy and Advocacy Committee and the National Council's Social Justice Advisory Committee. Margaret specialises in the areas of cost of living pressures, education and refugee support, and is a member of the Blackburn Souths Conference in Victoria. Tim McKenna has chaired the Vincentian Refugee Network in Australia since 2020 and represented Canberra-Goulburn since 2014. A long-time member of the Caritas Christi Conference in Canberra-Goulburn, he specialises in refugee support. Since 2016, Tim has also been active in Manus Lives Matter, visiting men held in Papua New Guinea on at least 5 occasions. Toby oConnor. Toby is the current CEO of the National Council of St Vincent de Paul Society. He's had over 40 years' experience in Australia's policy frameworks and has held senior executive leadership roles in the not-for-profit, private and government sectors. Toby is currently a member of the Commonwealth National Coordination Group, the Community Sector Advisory Group, the Blueprint Expert Reference Group, and the National Emergency Management Agency Charities Roundtable. A welcome to Margaret, Toby and Tim. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. The session will run for approximately an hour and will be recorded. The chat function is enabled for questions and our admin team will respond where possible. If we are unable to respond to your questions today, we'll make every effort to respond outside of this session. Could I have the next slide, please? How and why does the Society advocate for those in need? Advocacy, like commitment, compassion, respect, integrity, empathy, and courage, is one of our core values. Vincentians are called not only to assist those in need, but to challenge the root causes of poverty and injustice. Advocacy is an integral component of our DNA. If our Vincentians were unable to advocate for those we serve, I ask who would? I have a quote that I would like to present to you all, a quote from one of our founders, Frederick Ozanam. In 1848, Frederick was the Vice President of the Society of St Vincent de Paul. On the occasion of the General Assembly that year, he wrote a letter that spoke to the vital importance of advocacy that the Society was obligated to undertake based on how we encountered the poor. Frederick wrote, and I quote, "Yes, without doubt, it is too little to relieve the needy day by day. It is necessary to get to the root of the evil, and by wise reforms to diminish the causes of public misery. But we profess to believe that the science of welfare reform is learnt in books and parliamentary debates, than by climbing up the floors of the poor man's house, by sitting at his bedside, by suffering the same cold as him, and by drawing out the secret of his desolate heart through the outpouring of a friendly conversation. When we have fulfilled this ministry, not for a few months, but for many years, when we have thus studied the poor at home, at school, at the hospital, not in one city only, but in many, in the countryside, and in all the conditions where God has put it, then we begin to know the elements of this formidable problem of misery. Then we have the right to propose serious measures. And instead of frightening society, we give it consolation and hope." Next slide, please. Many wonder how we arrive at our policy positions. The Society's National Council, made up of state and territory presidents, approves our federal advocacy work. National Council is also advised by its Social Justice Advisory Committee and the Vincentian Refugee Network. These advisory bodies are made up of Society members from across the country, ensuring that advocacy remains connected to the real experiences of our local conferences and, most importantly, those we assist, our companions. Some of these members are also involved in their own social justice committees established in their respective state and territories. A small number of advocacy staff also support this work. Accordingly, our advocacy is informed by the experience of our companions, members, volunteers, and staff. It's also informed by Catholic social teaching, which calls us to uphold the dignity of the human person and the common good. The legacy of our founder, Frederick Ozanam, and St Vincent de Paul, the Society's guiding documents, including the rule and Australian and international social justice research and evidence. Some people also question our right to advocate. As a registered charity, we are allowed to advocate in line with our charitable purpose. Our advocacy is apolitical. We do not endorse any political party. Instead, we call on all political leaders to support policies that promote justice, equity, and dignity. Our federal advocacy materials outline the challenges faced by our companions and offer practical solutions that would improve their lives. The ultimate intention of our right to advocacy is twofold: to raise public awareness and to influence policy and decision makers. The upcoming federal election is an important opportunity to share information on federal policies that impact the lives of those we assist. We are asking our members to engage with candidates, share our materials, and advocate for the issues that matter most. Your knowledge of the issues in your local area needs to be heard by all those who seek political office and who are putting themselves forward as a representative of yours and their communities. As a result, we hope that more people will be aware of our policies, especially those lucky enough to represent their communities in Parliament. The catch cry or call to arms for the 2025 federal election is justice and compassion. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Justice and compassion is the Society's federal election statement, outlining the key justice priorities we are advocating for in the lead up to the election. It is a call for policies that promote fairness, dignity, compassion, and opportunity for all Australians. We recognise that conversations about social policy are not always easy. Sometimes this means challenging the status quo, discussing matters that are uncomfortable and what others would not want to hear. But this is what makes us a democracy. And as Vincentians, we have a responsibility to speak for those who are often unheard, and to do this in a way that is informed and respectful. To assist you in these conversations, we have developed two key resources: the Justice and Compassion leaflet, which summarises our calls for action, the practical policy changes we are seeking. And secondly, the Justice and Compassion booklet, which provides a more detailed exploration of the issues, the actions needed, and the evidence supporting our recommendations. The Justice and Compassion campaign focuses on four key areas where urgent action is needed. They are: 1, supporting an adequate safety net for all, so that no one is forced to live in poverty; ensuring housing security, so that all Australians have a safe and stable home; addressing the needs of First Nations peoples by supporting self-determination and justice; rising to the refugee challenge by ensuring humane and fair policies for those seeking asylum. These are not just policy issues, they are real challenges faced by the people we walk alongside every day. As members, your voices are crucial in ensuring that candidates and decision makers understand these realities. Throughout this webinar, we will explore each of these priority areas in more detail and discuss how you can help advocate for meaningful change in your local communities. I'd like to call upon Margaret to run us through one of those four actions that we're calling for. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you very much, Mark, and welcome everyone. I'm Margaret Gearon and I'm from Victoria, and I'm currently the chair of the National Social Justice Advisory Committee. I'm going to continue what Mark quoted before from Frederick Ozanam. Ozanam said, "You must not be content with tiding the poor over the poverty crisis. You must study the injustices which brought about such poverty with the aim of a long-term improvement." The 4 key areas for the 2025 federal election have been developed with this quote in mind. So, in supporting a safety net for all Australians as part of this federal election campaign, the Society is calling for the following. Firstly, a substantial increase in the working age and family domestic violence payments, and the improvement of indexation and earnings threshold to lift people out of poverty. To ensure a more equitable society, we need to address wealth inequalities and the underlying sources of these by working towards full employment for more people, increasing the base rate of income support payments, and reducing tax benefits which benefit those with most income and wealth. A robust safety net is also needed to build social equity into the economy, especially as long periods of poverty make it hard to escape from this poverty. For example, as poverty is now generally considered an intergenerational, children who experience poverty are less likely to come out of this as adults, especially if they live in disadvantaged neighbourhoods and regional or remote areas of Australia. The test of a just and compassionate society can be measured in part by how it treats those living in poverty or those who are marginalised. We, the society members, must push government to introduce members which will substantially improve how people across Australia in these categories of poverty are currently being treated. We want government to increase working age payments to help more people to cope with the rising costs of living and the subsequent pressures and stress caused, especially by the current prices of food, rent, petrol, and energy. We want to see the earnings threshold increased because most of those receiving job seeker are in minimal employment. An increase in this earnings threshold would allow those who are able and willing to work to earn more income and thus gain more work experience and hopefully transition to more full-time work. There's actually no evidence that increasing the job seeker allowance to $300 per fortnight would have a negative effect on encouraging people to move into employment. But doing this would allow more to be eligible for job seeker while not necessarily encouraging long-term reliance on this payment. Financial insecurity is one of the key factors which prevents those in a violent relationship from leaving, meaning that women and children are having to stay in or return to unacceptable living conditions. We need to ensure that those leaving a violent relationship can be assured of economic security and support for their well-being. Current payments for people leaving violent relationships are not easy to access. Eligibility for the crisis payment requires contacting Services Australia within 7 days of changed living arrangements and is the equivalent of 1 week's pay, not sufficient to start all over again. The leaving violence payment provides up to $5,000, $1,500 in cash and the rest in goods and services. But awareness of and accessibility to this appear not to be widespread. There's also a time limit on receiving this. Let me tell you a story that I was involved in last year here in Victoria with a number of conferences in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. One of our conferences up near the hills had picked up a young woman with 4 children who was homeless because of family violence. She'd originally had to move out of the house that she had been paying rent for successfully for the previous 5 years because of the violence that her partner was imposing on her and the children. So she fled to her mother's place in a regional area in Victoria. Unfortunately, the mother died suddenly of a stroke, and the rest of the family threw her and the children out of the mother's house, and so they had to come back to the local area around the hills where they'd been. That's when our conferences picked them up and spent a considerable number of weeks. Of course, the first thing that I said was, have you helped her to access the $5,000 leaving violence payment? They tried, but she'd been away from the incident which had caused her to have to leave the place that she had been renting for too long, and she was no longer eligible for that $5,000. So the society here in Victoria spent up to almost $10,000 over a number of weeks supporting her and the children in accommodation, until eventually I was forced to do the one thing that I hope nobody else ever has to do, and that was to say, we can't afford to spend money on another night's accommodation for them. Put them out on the footpath, ring the local agency and tell them they're homeless. And that's what we did. Well, that's certainly got the local agency responsible for family and domestic violence in our eastern suburbs area in Melbourne into action. And within 3 weeks, we had permanent accommodation, a long way away from there, but nevertheless, permanent accommodation, stable accommodation, where she and the children could hopefully settle down again just in time for Christmas. I hope that story means something to people. The Society urges government to address the inadequate working age payments as well, as part of its mission to build a just and compassionate society for everyone. The second part of the calling for action in the supporting a safety net for all Australians is to improve access to bulk billing and healthcare affordability, especially for low-income households. Access to medical bulk building services is essential for those who can't afford to pay the rising costs of medical services. Higher out-of-pocket costs for medical services, together with the rising cost of living in general, mean that more people are doing without medical services and presenting to emergency departments at hospitals, adding to the strain on these. Our third point is we would like to see the implementation of the Select Committee's 2023 Employment Services Report to better support underemployed and long-term unemployed people. There were 75 recommendations in the final report of this committee, and the Society is calling for more government action to implement these. There are many factors which can have an impact on a person's ability to engage in employment, whether full-time, part-time, or even occasional or sessional. I go back to job seeker recipients. Figures show that approximately 60% of these have been on the payment for more than 1 year, with the average time being 176 weeks. Many conferences that I know provide regular assistance to people who have been on job seeker for considerably longer periods than these, particularly with the stricter eligibility criteria for the disability support pension and the raised age to qualify for the aged pension. I'd like to give you another example from my experiences. My local conference has been working with this young woman for about the past 10 years. For the past 2.5 to 3 years, her physical condition has been such, she was on job seeker payment and still is on job seeker payment, a small part of it. But her physical condition, her health condition has deteriorated considerably over the last 2.5 to 3 years. And now there's absolutely no hope, according to the doctor and specialist, that she will be able to work again. Nevertheless, she's been told by Services Australia that she's not eligible for the disability support pension because she's got too many assets. So we in the conference have been trying to advocate for her and fight for her to get her that access to that disability support pension. I can assure everyone that it is not easy. Let's get back to employment now. Barriers to accessing employment include coming from a linguistically and culturally diverse background, which particularly affects refugees and asylum seekers, being a First Nations person, being homeless or facing house insecurity, and those living with mental health, drug, alcohol, and disability issues. Again, I'm going to give you an example from my own conference work. We've been helping a young woman with 2 children for approximately the last 11 or 12 years. Just prior to COVID, we finally got her together with Anglicare to a position where she had done employment training. We had taken her to one of the places in the city in Melbourne to get clothes that were suitable for employment interviews. She felt positive, we felt positive, and we were getting her ready for her first interview. Within 24 hours, because of her mental health conditions and unfortunately some drug abuse, all that fell apart. and now we are still supporting her. The children were taken away from her by the Department of Family Services, and now we continue to support her as she battles with knowing that she will never work but will always be on JobSeeker. Employment services fail to match people seeking work with meaningful jobs or to provide pre-employment support to ensure work readiness. So there's a need to reform these services so that more people can be better helped to access jobs. Employment training programs need to be improved so that they enhance self-esteem, align with people's skills and experience, and in particular, meet labour market demands and are flexible in their approaches to placing people in suitable work situations. The Society supports, along with other organisations, a full employment objective. To conclude this part on supporting a safety net for all Australians, let's remember the rule section 7.1, which reminds us the Society is concerned not only with alleviating need, but also with identifying the unjust structures that cause it. As committed members of the St Vincent de Paul Society, we must help people to reach their full potential, whatever their background, circumstances, or beliefs. And we must continually remind government that it is their duty to ensure that their policies and fiscal management are equally directed to those people in greatest need of economic and social security to help them to become less dependent on the Society's support. As Frederick Ozanam said, there is no charity without justice. And for us, and the theme of this campaign, there is no justice without compassion. Thanks, Mark. I'll turn back to you.
Thanks, Margaret. I'd now like to call on Toby, who'll cover off the next component of our justice and compassion priorities, that being housing security. So, Toby, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, participants. I'm coming to you from the office of the National Council here in Canberra, which is on the lands of the Ngambie and Ngunnawal peoples. I want to start with a reflection that I held from a few weeks ago when I went out on the soup van here in Canberra. We went to the very centre of the CBD on Northbourne Avenue. There's a tiny little park there where we set up and provide hot drinks and sandwiches and fruit to those who are homeless. On the night that I was there were actually 2 tents set up in that park, very like the tent in the slide that you can see. And it really rams home the state of homelessness and housing in Australia. Homelessness has always been a core element of the Society's work, and in recent decades, housing policy has been added to where we search out for better outcomes for folks. We are in Canberra. We're roughly 5 minutes from Parliament House, and we often walk the corridors of the Parliament, sometimes referred to as the Tin Rattlers, along with our other colleagues from the major church charities. But that sort of dissipates when we provide them with our written documents that are well argued and supported by the evidence that we get from our members about how people are doing it tough in the community. There's a few things that we have got in our policy for this federal election. The first one is to recognise housing as a human right and to legislate the National Housing and Homelessness Plan. So there is a coalition of the major not-for-profits and charities who really are very keen to get a National Housing and Homelessness Plan put in place. One of the reasons for this is it would make the Parliament accountable for actually delivering on the plan. In 2024, there was a push to actually include this as a human right. And we have both Senator Pocock and Senator MP Tink from Tasmania indicating that they would support this going forward in the future Parliament. So we are calling for the government to legislate on this and we hope that in a future parliament where there's likely to be a sharing of the benches to form government, that this will be one of the talking points and one of the bargaining chips that the crossbenchers might be able to put up. That brings us to the second point there about the Housing Australia Future Fund. We know that nationally over 167,000 households are on social housing wait lists, and more than 640,000 homes are needed to meet current need. Research commissioned by our colleagues in New South Wales found that over 57,000 households are currently waiting for social housing in that state alone, with projections rising to over 220,000 by 2024 if we can't stop the current situation from getting worse. Now, it's true that the HAF has $10 billion, and that's a very positive step. We congratulated the government when that was when that was passed finally in the Senate. We are aware that the coalition is planning to scrap the HAF. We would be really pushing to at least double that HAF to $20 billion, which would allow for an extra 25,000 new social housing dwellings. Slightly related to the housing policies of the government, for not-for-profits involved in the housing and homelessness sector, one of the problems that we have is when grants are given out, they're not always indexed along with the CPI that comes out during the budget process. And one of the things that we are also calling on the government to do is to actually deliver those indexation figures in a transparent manner so that our staff who are employed in working in our homelessness and housing facilities across Australia and those run by other charitable and not-for-profit organisations actually can get a full amount of the indexation, because at the moment it's very non-transparent and we're aware that we don't get the full amount that's allocated through the budget process. That also brings us into what we are wanting, which is pretty wide reform. And one of those areas is in the Commonwealth rental assistance. There was a 15% increase in the Commonwealth rent assistance, and we welcomed that when the government passed that. And its efforts over the last two budgets have actually seen the assistance rise by 25% since 2023. But we know from what our volunteers and our members tell us who actually are looking after folk in crisis, that for many low-income households, it just is not enough. At the last count, nearly half of all rent assistance recipients were still in rental stress, and many are left with less than $250 per week after paying rent. Obviously, this includes groups like single parents, older renters, people on job seeker and on the disability support pension. We are calling for a further increase to rent assistance, along with a full review of its design and eligibility. And in those calls, we note that the Productivity Commission and the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee have both recommended this, noting that the payment just is not keeping pace with rising rents and that many people in similar circumstances are treated differently based on which support payment they receive. When we talk about reform to try and address the housing stress and crisis that we are facing, which really is the outcome of 35 years of successive Commonwealth governments doing nothing in this space, we do suggest that we need to address some of our taxation incentives that are involved in the housing sphere. So our current tax system continues to favour investment in housing over access and affordability. The Society supports a modest reduction of the capital gains tax discount from 50% to 37.5%, and the phased removal of negative gearing to help rebalance the housing market in favour of home ownership. These tax settings have contributed to rising inequality. At the moment, the wealthiest 20% of households now own more residential property by value than all other households combined. Meanwhile, home ownership is declining, especially among younger and middle income Australians. We are particularly concerned about the intergenerational debt around housing and the non-affordability housing that we are passing on to our children and grandchildren. It's simply not sustainable. Recent analysis by the Parliamentary Budget Office found that the cost of negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions on investment properties is nearly $11 billion. That's $11 billion that's returned to people, although they've paid no money. And it's projected to rise to 165 billion over the next decade. So we are pushing for a modest change to the capital gains tax discount, which could help fund meaningful improvements such as an increase to the rent assistance without affecting most households. On the last dot point, protecting renters and promote equity, we are again aware from feedback from our members who go into the homes of folks who are on low incomes, who are struggling with rent, who mean that they have to rent facilities that are not good around energy efficiency, etc. We would like the government to support expanding the National Retrofit Fund to upgrade low-income housing with a focus on insulation and electrification. We know that some of our society agencies are involved in delivering these services, and they report that they are highly successful. We're also calling for minimum energy performance standards for rentals and subsidies of no interest loans to help low-income households access upgrades. The ACOS research shows that almost all low-income households struggle with energy bills, and many are already in debt. Only 1 in 4 renters has ceiling insulation, and 1 in 3 reports being too cold most of the time in winter. The government's $500 million commitment to retrofit 50,000 social housing properties is a fantastic start, but further investment is needed to reach more households, especially those in private rentals. And we also want the Commonwealth to move in a direction to bring about minimum standards for renters. There's been a lot of debate about this over the life of the Parliament, with many people saying that it's a state issue, but we believe that the Commonwealth can also be a positive mover to get something put in place that looks after the standards that more and more people are having to rely on to get past in their rental properties. So Mark, with that, I'm passing back to you.
Thanks, Toby. I'd now like to talk about and address the third objective that we're looking to achieve through our justice and compassion advocacy work, and that's meeting the needs of First Nations people. As an organisation deeply committed to social justice, the St Vincent de Paul Society recognises that we cannot achieve justice in Australia without addressing the systemic disadvantages faced by First Nations people across this country. Despite decades of commitments, First Nations peoples continue to experience significantly worse outcomes in health, education, housing, employment, and the justice system. The persistence of these inequalities points to systemic failures that require urgent, coordinated action, leadership, and genuine partnership. The Closing the Gap framework was designed to reduce these disparities, but progress has been slow and in some areas has in fact been going backwards. The latest update from the Productivity Commission shows that only 4 of the 19 targets are currently on track, while outcomes are worsening in key areas such as incarceration, child protection, and suicide prevention. Between 2023 and 2025, the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in prison increased by 15%. Since the baseline year of 2019, the increase has been 30%. Meanwhile, the rate of Indigenous children in out-of-home care remains remarkably and alarmingly high, 50 per 1,000 children, with no improvement in the last year. The Commission also highlighted a broader concern that governments had not taken enough meaningful action to fulfil their commitments under the National Agreement. Commissioner Selwyn Button noted that the ongoing failure to meet targets shows the need for stronger implementation of the agreement's priority reforms. While we welcome the 2023 referendum as a moment of national reflection, the result reinforced the need for renewed efforts to support self-determination, invest in community-led solutions, and ensure accountability in government action. The Society are calling for the following: implementing the Closing the Gap priority reforms. The Closing the Gap framework was designed to drive systemic change, but as the Productivity Commission and the Luajita Institute have noted, progress remains too slow. The most recent data shows that only 5 of the 19 targets are on track, as mentioned previously, and outcomes are worsening in key areas such as incarceration, suicide, and children in out-of-home care. However, where governments have fully embraced the priority reforms, like strengthening Aboriginal community-controlled organisations and shared decision-making, improved outcomes are being achieved. The message is really clear. Sustained investment in First Nations-led solutions works, and governments must commit to fully implementing the reforms. Raising the age of criminality. Australia continues to incarcerate children as young as 10, despite international human rights standards and clear evidence of the harm that this causes. The Society joins calls from the National Children's Commissioner, the Law Council of Australia, and Aboriginal Legal Services to raise the minimum age to at least 14. We support the Help Way Earlier report, which highlights the need for early support services and a whole-of-government approach to child wellbeing. While some jurisdictions have taken steps, progress is inconsistent, and in some cases, such as Victoria and the Northern Territory, they have been reversed. Holding children in detention does not address the root causes of disadvantage. In fact, it does the opposite. It reinforces them. We strongly support the expansion of community-led justice reinvestment as a proven alternative to incarceration. The government's commitment of $69 million to support up to 30 communities through the National Justice Reinvestment Program is welcome. And we support ongoing annual funding of $20 million from 2026 to 27. Justice reinvestment reduces offending by addressing underlying drivers such as poverty, trauma, and housing security through place-based support services, not simply punishment by incarceration. The Society also welcomes the creation of an independent justice reinvestment unit and urges continued investment beyond the initial 30 communities. Following the 2023 referendum, which the Society actively advocated for, the Society remains committed to the full implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We believe the truth-telling is essential to reconciliation, acknowledging both the strength of First Nations peoples and the ongoing impacts of colonisation. We support treaty-making processes that recognise First Nations sovereignty and rights, and the establishment of structures that ensure First Nations people have a real say in decisions that affect their lives. As noted by Reconciliation Australia and the Lowitja Institute, progress on truth, treaty and voice is central to building trust and improving outcomes. Finally, I'd now like to hand over to Tim McKenna, who will speak about the importance of human and just refugee policy. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Mark, and good afternoon to you all. Let's go on the refugee challenge. Pope Francis regularly urges us to reach out to people on the periphery of our society, including refugees and people seeking asylum. So Vinnie's does that across Australia. The three Vinnie's calls shown on the slide can be divided into two categories. First two call on the next government to address injustices that have been inflicted on these people for more than a decade. Our proposals are to fund an adequate safety net for all asylum seekers, to implement a fairer process for all affected by the offshore processing, affected by the unjust fast-track process, and resettle in Australia all people still subject to offshore processing. The last call about welcoming more refugees and their families is a positive request to build on the good work that Australia is already doing. Let's begin by discussing a safety net for all people seeking asylum. Thousands of these people cannot work because either they don't have work rights or they have family responsibilities and chronic health issues, disabilities, or are elderly. Before 2017, most received payments from the Status Resolution Support Service and had access to Medicare. Since then, SRSS eligibility has reduced that number to only 1,000. As a result, at least 5,000 vulnerable people have been made destitute with no income, no access to Medicare for 8 years. This clearly has had a serious impact on these people who've already experienced great trauma in countries from which they've fled. It's also very serious for charities trying to support them. What's the solution? Pretty clearly, the next government should provide an adequate safety net for all asylum seekers by expanding the SRSS eligibility criteria to those used before 2017, and also give work rights to those people currently denied them so they can contribute to our society, which is suffering significant labour shortage. The second issue in this first call is a fairer refugee assessment process for 7,000 people currently seeking asylum. These people have been living in our community for 13 years, suffering under the harsh fast-track refugee assessment process developed specifically for them, but which was found to be unfair by the Australian Human Rights Commission. Unfortunately, this fast-track process, among its other flaws, didn't allow proper review of decisions, resulting in higher rates of rejection and increasing the risk of unsafe deportation. As well, the process has taken so long that the circumstances in the countries from which they've fled have generally worsened. So these people live in great fear that they may yet be returned in danger to their homeland. Finally, these people, many with children here, now have strong connections to and deep roots in our community, and also make important contributions to our country, such as the Biloela family, who were granted permanent visas at the direction of the new minister back in 2002. There's been a small trickle of such grants, which has started recently, but only 19 were made in the last 5 months of 2024. One politician noted that at that rate, it would take more than a century to process the full 7,000 people. What's the solution? Again, pretty simple. implement a fairer and more timely process for all people still subject to the fast-track regime. Now on to offshore processing. Well, it's been 12 years since Australia forcibly moved 4,000 people to Papua New Guinea and Nauru for processing of their refugee claims. Some of you may be surprised to know that there are still 37 people in Port Moresby, one of the most dangerous cities in the world, particularly for poor foreigners, which they certainly are. All have serious medical conditions, almost all of which cannot be treated effectively in PNG, and half have no hope of safe resettlement. But there are also 1,000 people medically evacuated from PNG to Nauru who are still here. They have continued to suffer here for years because the government policy is that they will never be permanently settled here. They live on visas that need to be renewed every few weeks, or at the most every 6 months. Great way to live. Around 700 have no prospect of safe permanent resettlement and so live in fear of deportation to an unsafe country, including even their homeland. While the Nauru detention centre was emptied in 2023, it's now started to fill up again with around another 100 people there. Their health is deteriorating in the same way as it did with previous detainees. We're not learning lessons. What's the solution for these problems? Well, frankly, after a decade of trying, it's time to accept that most will never be resettled safely elsewhere. So let's just allow them to stay in Australia as permanent residents. And in the meantime, and most urgently, we must evacuate all the people still on Nauru and PNG while we organise their permanent resettlement. Finally, onto something a bit more positive. Welcoming more refugees and their families. Firstly, through the Humanitarian Refugee Program. In 2023, the United Nations estimated 2 million refugees needed urgent resettlement around the world. But only 160,000 were in fact settled that year, with the United States being the major recipient and Australia taking 20,000. But by 2025, that's this year, the UN figure was 2.9 million, while in January, as we know, the new US government suspended its program. So I think we in Australia need to do more to help in this area. Australia's Refugee Council notes government research in 2011 showed refugees make significant economic and social contributions to our country. So the Society has joined the Refugee Council to call on the next government to increase our annual refugee intake. But we can do more through a successful bipartisan innovation. This is the Community Refugee Integration and Settlement Pilot, CRISP, established by the coalition government in previous years and now made permanent, no longer a pilot, by the Labor government. CRISP involves volunteers providing 12 months of support and welcome for a refugee household from their arrival. 1,500 refugees are being settled over 4 years. Such community sponsorship enriches civic life, fosters social cohesion, enhances refugees' independence, and helps regional communities attract and retain migrants. Currently, CRISP numbers come out of the humanitarian refugee cap. But if these were made additional, Labor now proposes, we could increase our refugee intake without fuss, supported by local communities. And finally, many refugees flee without their families, so they can't really start rebuilding their lives in peace until reunited with those families. Australia has a good family reunion program, but there are many obstacles. Eligibility criteria are too restrictive. There are lengthy delays and applications are complex. Should be reformed. In conclusion, then, Finney's believes implementing the 3 calls on your screen will address most of these injustices Australia has inflicted on asylum seekers in the last decade. And it will also build on the good work that Australia has done in relation to taking refugees. Thanks, and over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Tim. And thanks to all of our speakers this afternoon, Margaret and Toby, for sharing your critical insights into the challenges facing people experiencing poverty, housing insecurity, discrimination and displacement. The issues that we've all discussed this afternoon affect all of us. Whether you're a member of the St Vincent de Paul Society, a volunteer, a supporter, a staff member, or simply someone who cares about social justice, you have an important role to play in shaping a fairer Australia. Advocacy is not just for experts or policymakers. It is about raising awareness, having conversations, and pushing for change where it is needed most. There are three key takeaways that you can all help contribute. Firstly, engage with candidates and decision makers. If you have an opportunity, ask your local candidates about their policies on social security, affordable housing, First Nations justice, and refugee protections. Use the Justice and Compassion little booklet as a guide for your discussions, and ensure these issues remain a priority throughout the election period. Reach out to your local representatives through emails, letters, or community events. Politicians need to hear directly from the people that they represent. Secondly, raise awareness and start conversations. Share what you've learned today with your friends, family, workplace, and local networks. Use your platforms, whether it's through faith groups, community organisations, social media, or personal conversations to ensure these issues stay visible. If you're comfortable, write to your local newspaper or participate in public discussions to share why these issues matter. Finally, I call on you to support the Society's advocacy efforts. Stay informed about our election advocacy by following updates from the St Vincent de Paul Society via our website. If you're involved in local outreach or community services, consider how advocacy can be integrated into your work. Look out for further opportunities to engage with the Justice and Compassion campaign, whether by attending events, supporting online actions, or amplifying key messages. This is a collective effort. We're all in it together. No one person or organisation can solve these issues alone, but together we can create change. Whether through small actions or larger advocacy efforts, your voice matters. In the lead up to this election, let us stand together to push for policies that reflect compassion, justice, and dignity for all. Thank you, everybody, once again for your time and commitment today. It's been a joy sharing this time with you all. And once again, I'd like to thank Tim, Margaret, and Toby for your input this afternoon. There will be a recording of this webinar will be available on the Justice and Compassion website, along with other resources. So once again, thanks to everybody. Have a pleasant night. I notice there's been a number of questions that have been posted online, and Rose has been diligently responding to those. So once again, thanks everybody, and have a pleasant evening.